In a landmark decision on Friday, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to put measures in place to avoid genocide in Gaza, but did not impose the ceasefire that South Africa had demanded. It was made clear in the ruling that the court did not come to a determination about the reality of a genocide in process, despite acknowledging South Africa's argument that a viable case of genocide might be heard. What are the potential implications of this decision? Joining me now to discuss this further is SA Research Chair of African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Chris Landsber. Professor Landsber, thank you so much for your time. Not a ceasefire, but the ICJ saying South Africa does have a stance and calling on Israel to implement measures to prevent a genocide. What do you make of yesterday's outcome?
Let me try and do three things just very briefly and hopefully succinctly. I suppose there is a moral, ethical response we can give, and I think South Africa did it exceptionally well. I don't like this rhetoric about who won and who lost. I mean, I think we're dealing here with such a murky, terrible international event, and the world is bereft with conflicts. I don't think this is about who won and is. But I think on the moral, ethical score, I think South Africa should be proud of itself. It put a very strong case forward. It equipped itself very well, and I think South Africa now has its work cut out to go and monitor whether that fourth point by the judge president will be adhered to, that Israel will change its conduct radically from yesterday and the next 30 days. The evidence I've seen so far doesn't bode very well. Politically, however, I have to say to you that we're going to have a very busy few weeks, months, even years ahead of us, but let's focus on the weeks and months. This thing is now going to the higher table of international relations, the UN Security Council, and that's where the next action will be. I must also say to you politically, I expect more actions against Israel. I expect more states and not state actors to almost piggyback onto South Africa's case and take this thing forward. I think you've summed it up brilliantly, thirdly, when you said signs of genocide. It's a preliminary case. The court did not err in that respect. We shouldn't criticize the court in that respect. It executed its mandate. I think what's baffling for many people, even myself as somebody who've been reading international relations for so long, is that what the court effectively said is that Israel, we see signs of genocide. If you continue, you're going to be guilty of it, but more importantly, take control of your soldiers who seems to be perpetrating this thing, stop the genocidal actions. But then, as you said, and that for me is the crux, they couldn't bring themselves to utter the word cessation of hostilities, let alone ceasefire, not even to talk about ending the war. So the drama is only beginning now politically in a very serious way.
And correctly so, Professor Landsberg. I mean, it is going to be a busy couple of weeks, months and years ahead of us, with the UN Security Council expected to meet next week, with those monthly reports that we're scheduled to be getting as well from Israel. But also, when you're talking about you don't like the argument, the perspective of who won this case or who has provisionally won or provisionally lost, it's quite interesting to see how this provisional ruling has been interpreted by opposing sides. You know, on the one hand, the South African government, the ruling ANC, has welcomed it as a victory, calling it a watershed moment. And then the other hand, we've got the allies of Israel as well, such as the US, saying, well, in fact, The ruling kind of speaks to what we've been saying all along. It didn't call for a ceasefire, so they're seeing that as some sort of a right up their alley as well. So the interpretation of this provisional ruling seems to be kind of murky depending on who's reading it.
No. Let me build on your very important point, because I think that point you make is pivotal. I think that point you make is fundamental. Let's not harp too much on the fact that it's got to be interpreted differently. But I would even put your words in my own terms slightly stronger. Ironically, a ruling that should have brought more clarity, and I think it did bring more clarity morally and ethically. So I'm not going to be those who are going to go on a tangent here against the court. However, the fact that this court could not, and I suppose there's case law and history, why not? The fact that the court could not bring itself to ask for a cessation of hostilities says much, and I would have loved to be a fly on the walls of those august buildings. But let me take three short examples, because we press for time to reinforce your point. Let's start with Israel. Not only did Israel, before, maybe in anticipation, but before the ruling said they will not accept it, albeit that Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to come across as more measured afterwards, and he did not at all, because he sent a warning that nothing's going to stop us from going after Hamas. In fact, he almost said in so many words, we've been given the green light by the court to continue to go after Hamas, yet the court also says, but we want you to stop the carnage of civilians and the absolutely Armageddon-like destruction of the place. But there are two actors that I want to single out here before I make a last point. Britain's response was telling. Britain, Prime Minister Sunak, he almost rubbished the decision, but there was something to the madness of what he said. He said, the court said, and of course he vehemently disagreed, and said he stands with Israel and distanced himself. He said the court found, according to them, signs of genocidal action, but the court did not stop and call for a ceasefire. That comes from the British Prime Minister, who came on vehemently in case of Israel. But here is the point. The United States of America, their short, very short and crisp statement says it all for me. And let me quote the words for you, because it's stuck in my mind, the words by America. This will not change our stance on Hamas. If we want to take it literally, you and I, what America effectively said, we interpreted everything that was said by this court and everything that was done, and South Africa's quote-unquote, as they described it prior to, foolish actions by going to the court in the first place. They interpret this whole thing through the lenses of annihilating Hamas and therefore by extension continuing with a war. So, to put it in mild terms for you, briefly, we're back to square one in a very ironic sense, but there's a ray of hope and light here. Many states are going to enter the fray. The world is going to be more divided because of this decision. Southern countries will be bold. They will take on Western powers, the U.S. and the U.S. and others in fora like the UN Security Council, and Western states. You're going to see many more divisions. The way Germany changed their stance, they appealed to Israel to adhere to the findings of the court. This is the same Germany who just 2 weeks ago said they disagree that this is genocide to begin with. They now appeal to Israel to adhere to the outcomes of the court's findings.
So we are seeing that shift as well. And then also, do you think that South Africa's action has also prompted a shift across the globe? Because if we look, in the U.S., for instance, a federal courthouse in Oakland, California, is hosting a trial for those U.S. leaders that they say are complicit in this genocide, including the U.S. President Joe Biden. So we've got people within his own country as well who are using their arms of the law to try and hold their governments to account for their complicity.
What I appreciate about your question, I'm not one of those analysts who are scared to say when I got it wrong or I didn't see something coming. But I can tell you that the ramifications, the implications, the fundamental changes on an already volatile world order as we know it. The implications of South Africa's bold action has just opened up the floodgates of a tense, volatile, anarchic, uncertain world. Even more divisions are going to be great. And to answer your question very specifically, certainly not in the next decade or 2 decades did I anticipate that America of all states, who sees itself as the undisputed hegemon to lay down the law to others, now faces the prospects, and you and I will talk in 2-3 weeks again, that's of course if you would like to invite me back, that is, but that America might now face court cases and actions where it will have to defend that it was not complicit in potential or prospective acts of genocide as pronounced by the court. That's where we are. In a nutshell, the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American world as we knew it, dominated by states from a certain history and has a strong racial dimension to it. I think South Africa has, with this action, and it's not the only thing that has brought this about, but South Africa's actions has started to turn the old order dominated by the West to think that 7 powers can lay down the rule for 202 states. South Africa has turned this on its head, but it's going to be a slow and grinding process. And may I just end by saying to you, politically, they're coming for South Africa. They're not happy. They're not impressed. The Western powers, that is.
Scary thought that. But what do you make of those 6 provisional measures that the ICJ said Israel must take all measures within its powers to prevent the commission of acts within the scope of Article 2 of the 1948 Genocide Convention? But Professor Landsber, Israel has consistently said that they are doing all they can to prevent a genocide. In Israel's view, the over 25,000 people that have been killed, that is all they can do.
The unfortunate thing about the underlying answer that I'm going to give to your question is that we can almost predict, as far as I'm concerned, what Israel's report in a month is going to say. But we have been opening the floodgates for humanitarian aid. But we did not deliberately target infrastructure and water infrastructure. And more importantly, we did not try to create conditions of inhumane and that those words by the judge, that of almost treating a people to the point that you could, quote unquote, annihilate them, cleanse them, remove them from the face of the earth. So there's got to be lots of contrasting, contradicting, sometimes vehement, sometimes vitriolic and tense, different narratives. So I just want to end before your next question by saying this to you. The irony for me about yesterday's findings is that the court said, Israel, to come to your point, these 6 points we are telling you are not just advice that we're giving you. These are the points that hint in the direction of a clear, unadulterated genocidal action, and we will come and investigate. But to not call for a ceasefire, which many states are now going to try and push for, the Arab states in particular, why couldn't the court bring itself to that? And I'm willing to give you an answer that as much as we think it's a bunch of independent judges, and I'm not criticizing anyone in particular of them, they had to anticipate what kind of political actions could come, and they steered clear from certain things. What I would advise South Africa, however, that in spite of that, take a stand on the release of hostages. You don't have to wait for whether the court did or did not pronounce itself on that. You are now on the moral high ground. You now seize this, take this, whatever Israel and others are going to do, and you pave the way with your partners to bring us to the point of a ceasefire that will bring to an end one of the longest standing conflicts in the world that has caused immeasurable, unthinkable, ghastly destruction and grief and sorrow and horror to people.
Professor Landsber, we definitely will be inviting you back as we keep a close eye on this crisis on Gaza. Thank you so much for your time.